Okay, we're here with James Howard, Ph.D. today. How's it going?
Everything's going great. How are you doing today?
Good. First question here is Mars One proposed giving its future colonists lessons in civics and governance systems as part of their training. Do you think this is a good idea or a bad one, and why?
I think it's absolutely a good idea. One of the things I've talked about before is the importance of building good governance structures when colonizing Mars or the Moon or anything else like that. Whether it's even ranging from something as simple as a space station here circling Earth to a ship, a generation ship traveling away, never to be seen again. Because those sorts of governance structures are going to be what holds they're going to be the fabric that holds the society together there. And I think that we see, when you have a stable governance structure, a compact people are willing to abide by, it allows people to resolve their conflicts amicably. It's going to become a critical tool for them in a way that should reduce violence, should reduce risk, and should reduce possibility of something going very horribly wrong. So, now what exactly that government's going to look like, whether it's Mars or the Moon or whatever, or even, if we just, built another city, from the ground up, in, say, the desert here. It's, those sorts of decisions are decisions that need to be made at the time and based on the actual circumstances people are engaged in. If people are facing one set of circumstances, for instance, it's a very high-risk environment, as, say, going to Mars is, it's very, very different than, say, just building a new city in the desert, where, we kind of understand what we're doing here, even though it's, maybe not necessarily as pleasant as we think. So those sorts of governance structures that are developed need to be responsive to the challenges that are going to be faced. It should not be pre-planned.
Okay. So
it's a very long answer in some ways.
That's all right. What sort of governance systems do you see becoming the norm for future space colonies or confederations of colonies that might form for specific purposes like trade?
Well, and trade becomes very important for deciding governance structures. I think we would all like to believe that people will, eventually move towards democratic societies. But one of the things we see here on Earth is the more resource-driven an economy is, the less democratic it is. We don't have a lot of, high natural resource democratic societies. For instance, we don't have a lot of large petroleum exporting countries that are very democratic, basically the United States and Canada being the exceptions to that. We don't have societies that have a lot of mineral wealth that are very democratic. The most democratic societies we have are those that are service-oriented and those with strong knowledge economies, where people get on and they do a job where they have to think versus something where they do a lot of labor, physical labor. So it depends on, if that continues to hold like that, and we see a lot of, resource-driven economics at Mars or on an asteroid or wherever, it's going to be a more autocratic government with less democracy. The best way to approach it. If we see, exceptions are going to be if we see some very small communities develop that kind of where everyone really knows each other, and I mean really knows each other. You can see it form more like a co-op, but those don't work very well at scale. So if we are looking forward to, how we're going to be building those governments and what they're most likely going to look like, it's going to be driven based on what the trade is.
Awesome. So, what elements of the colonization of space do you think would be most conducive to developing governance structures that are friendly towards trade that includes decentralized cryptocurrencies?
That's a more complicated question, and that's because the speed of light becomes an issue. With round trip time, and this is all, again, happens at different scales. But if we have a government or if we have a society we're trading with that is more or less independent but located at the Moon, it's no big deal because the communications round trip time between Earth and the Moon is like half a second. With Earth to Mars, life gets more interesting. because there your minimum round trip time is 6 minutes, and your maximum round trip time is 42 minutes. Now we can look at an existing cryptocurrency. The big one, of course, is Bitcoin. Bitcoin expects a 10-minute lag in the network for verifying transactions, and 10 minutes is just fine because it knows to expect it. And it's no big deal. At 42 minutes, that doesn't necessarily mean that transactions can be verified. Now, those are technical limitations based on Bitcoin. If the built-in lag time were an hour, hey, it works out just fine. The other problems that start to arise are with any good system you're using. I mean, whenever you're selling anything, whether it's a bottle of water, or a barrel of oil, or a load of CDs for those people who still actually buy CDs. One of the big costs that gets embedded in that is the cost of transportation. The cost of transportation, in a lot of ways, will dominate trade between Earth and anywhere else. It still costs $10,000 a pound to put something into orbit, and a lot more to go further than that. So when we're looking at these costs, we're going to see these things get embedded in that, and that becomes a much more driving factor in whether or not we're doing that sort of interplanetary trade than really the governance structure we use to manage that trade and finance that trade. Now, that said, there has been a proposal, and there in fact is an existing network for a cryptocurrency called Mars Coin that exists. It's designed to provide currency for use at Mars, and that's great. It's absolutely fantastic. And on planet, because they're going to have local networks that are moving very fast, just like we have here on Earth, that'll work just fine. But making those transitions between the local distribution or the local currency and an off-planet currency are where things are going to start to go wrong. And there's been some study done on this showing that interest rates are going to be eventually collapse down to whatever the price of energy, the cost of moving something. And that becomes very important for understanding how this all works in the grand scheme of things. When those interest rates start to fall towards the cost of energy, you'll see that then you'll have a kind of a perfect market and things will flow very well, but you actually have to get there. Now, the funny thing about that study, and that was actually done by Paul Krugman in the 70s, almost as a joke, but it turns out the analysis is correct. The cost of money between interplanetary trade falls to the price of energy for moving things. On the other side, when you have a cryptocurrency in a perfectly smooth and functioning economy around a cryptocurrency, the cost of the next coin is the cost of the energy to mine it. The energy becomes this whole underlying, the cost of energy becomes truly the underlying currency. And whether we're dealing with it in dollars or euro or pounds or Bitcoin or Mars Coin or whatever, we're just denominating it a different way.
Awesome. So,
I know that's a really complicated answer to what should be a really simple question. It turns out it's a very complicated question.
Yeah, that's all right. How do you think trade should be managed among colonies who are used to self-governance and may have reason to distrust the centralized power structures?
So ultimately, they'll be trading whatever it is they have to trade with each other, right? Mm-hmm. All economics are barter systems. We just use dollars here on Earth, well, in the United States. We use dollars, and in Europe they use euros as a way to simplify the process. The medium of exchange, the currency, is a way to smooth and facilitate it. So in the case of one of the things I talked about when I spoke at the Mars Society convention last year is, we will see small colonies across Mars. We're not going to see one big global government. We're going to see a colony founded by the United States, and one founded by China, and one by Europe, and one by Amazon, and so forth. That show, that each one is going to be there for a different reason. One might be mining iron ore, for instance. Another one is there actually to provide backbone services. Let's say, like this hypothetical Amazon colony might be there just to provide goods and services to other colonies. However they end up trading with each other, it's going to be just a reflection of whatever it is they have to give each other. So they could choose to pool their resources together into a common currency. Exactly what the euro is. And in a lot of ways, that's what the United States is, where we have each different state pooling its resources together into this national government to provide those financial services. To do the same thing at Mars might be something favorable. On the other hand, you're probably going to see local currencies developing and exchange rates happening between the two, because it turns out people don't necessarily want to trust each other. They couldn't trust each other to build their colonies together. They may not necessarily trust them to build their economies together, which reflects, again, what we see here on Earth and the current struggle for, why did Britain leave the European Union? Well, in a lot of ways, they weren't full-fledged members anyway, because they never trusted the currency. I mean, a lot of these problems we're discussing are problems we've seen here again and again and again on Earth. And sometimes they get solved one way, and sometimes they get solved another, and it just depends on the exact nature of the problem, the exact people involved, and if sometimes the personalities involved. There's really nothing that's going to say, this is the way it'll happen. There are just a lot of options.
Awesome. So, do you foresee any governance or technical problems that will have to be solved before cryptocurrencies and blockchain apps like smart contracts can be adopted as part of interplanetary trade?
Yeah, we're going to have to get over the speed of light somehow. The speed of light, it turns out, is a huge problem for, not just in science fiction, but also in reality. When you have a long-running, and like I said, even the 1 hour, let's say you drag the Bitcoin window to 1 hour instead of 10 minutes. That's great for Mars. It doesn't work when you get as far as Jupiter, though. So that's going to be a problem someone's going to have to solve, is how do we deal with live transactions? Or maybe there's a side chain. And unfortunately, my knowledge of the technical specifications of Bitcoin are not as good as they maybe should be. But there's this concept of a side chain where there are transactions happening in a separate ledger that can later be folded into the primary ledger. Maybe that's how it works. So you have this whole side chain going on, and say once a day it gets folded into the primary ledger. And that's in fact how smart contracts are already implemented. It's a side ledger that gets folded in periodically. If that's happening off-site and it gets folded in at the end of, let's say the end of the day, except the day is kind of a meaningless subject here, a meaningless term here, there's got to be some way that we can, since we're not going to fix the speed of light issue, the question is how can we get around it? And, a lot of this really just depends on what kind of communications infrastructure is put into place to facilitate whatever transactions are happening. I have a proposal in, I've not been approved yet, to talk at the Mars Society Convention this year, specifically about some of these issues with regard to how do we do these financing of infrastructure, and whether that's communications, water, air. How those decisions happen will in a lot of ways affect this. So
given Bitcoin's nature as a proof of work cryptocurrency and some alternative currencies, proof of stake algorithms, what improvements do you think should be implemented so that the interested parties like colonies or planets don't engage in an arms race for the purpose of seizing control of the network?
Oh, well, you see, I don't think that's actually going to work. I mean, right now, the cost of Bitcoin is driven primarily by the energy cost of mining coins. And we've already seen a few instances where, even if it was just briefly, like a few minutes, one particular mining network had the majority of the Bitcoin network long enough that it could have been disrupted, long enough that it could have been a full 50% plus one attack. And because of that, a lot of the mining pools have intentionally limited their size just to make sure they don't do that again. Now, let's say, hypothetically, I leave and go to Mars today, and I've got my laptop and a couple other computers with me because, I need a few extra just in case. That's all the computing power I have, and I'm easily outgunned by Earth on this one. There's no way to address that problem other than throwing a ton of processing power and then the energy to drive that processing power, to wherever we're going. that's not necessarily a good way to do this. And I think ultimately, at least initially, we'll see local crypto coins develop, because I think it's actually a very good approach. It saves you from having to print, kill trees that aren't there to print money, to manage the local economy, and then trade between Earth and Mars, let's say, is actually going to be really focusing on goods and not so much on, with an exchange of goods, Earth sending raw materials for building habitats and such, and not so much, paying for something in any currency. Now, things are going to end up getting denominated in some value, and if that happens today, it's going to be in dollars. If, we're looking 100 years down the line, who knows what the dominant economy will be, but it'll be denominated in that. Only as time really progresses and you see kind of parity between the two, will you see that 50% plus one problem start to disappear, and people trust that sort of interconnected mining network.
So that's all the questions I have. Anything you'd like to add?
No, I appreciate the opportunity to answer these questions. I hope I've answered them in a useful way for you.
Yep, you did. Thanks.
Thank you very much.